this is elaboration of what has been said. It is commonly assumed at present that traditional criticism has been completely displaced by modern Western criticism, which is regarded as a new current in Indian literary and aesthetic sensibility. But did or did not the earlier current leave behind it any silt which modified the new current? Besides, was the old current a single mainstream, or was it made up of several tributaries of, or which we have not lost sight now? Was the displacement of the indigenous by the alien a simple and unified phenomenon? These questions await satisfactory answers. But there is an even greater question which needs to be looked into in order to understand the precise nature of the crisis in Indian criticism. That question relates neither to the Sanskrit tradition or poetics nor to Western literary thought. It relates to literary criticism in the modern Indian languages, or to use the tradition Indian term, the bhashas. The bhashas. So the second paragraph begins with this question: is it the Western tradition that has replaced the Indian tradition of criticism? Okay, or the question is more complex. Uh, so he comes. The last line of the sentence of this paragraph says the question is more complex. It is of bhashas. Bhashas means Indian languages, modern Indian languages, not Sanskrit, not Sanskrit. So bhashas are the regional languages or vernaculars, or the people spoke them, and these develop as dialects in the social and economic, political and cultural life of these people living in these areas. So whether it is, now we know most of the language, most of the literary works that we have studied, they come from bhashas. They come from bhashas. This word bhasha is quite different from the word language, in the sense we see Sanskrit. Okay, so because this has a regional character, this has uh, the characteristics of a bhasha are closer to the characteristics of the villages or the small areas or people or farmers, or practices, religion, culture, rituals, folk songs, and marriage songs, death songs, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, a lot of people in the 19th century were writing in bhashas, So the writer actually is questioning what happened to the literary criticism that the bhashas produced. So when we say our criticism has been replaced by Western tradition, by that, do we mean the criticism that we received from Sanskrit tradition? Say, for example, uh, Natya Shastra, or for example, several other, literary critics from India. Okay, so there is a whole, generation after generation, you have certain names, those who talked about different kind of devices and literature. What does it mean? What is metaphor? And all those kinds of questions. But he's asking a very important question. All right, if Western tradition replaced the Sanskrit criticism, and so, but what happened to the critical uh, ideas or criticism that was produced by Marathi, or by, say, Hindi or Bengali or Odia or Malayalam, and so on and so forth, in the 18th, 19th, and all these centuries. So this is very important. Each bhasha has a tradition of literature which can be described in all fairness as a mature tradition. Some bhashas, like Kannada and Tamil, have literary histories of more than a millennium. Others, like Marathi and Gujarati, of 7 or 8 centuries. The bhashas were rapidly moving away from Sanskrit poetics, and it was not for several centuries that they were exposed to Western aesthetics. That exposure came in the wake of British colonial experience. But whereas Marathi literature, for instance, is believed to have made a glorious beginning in the 19th, 13th century, literary criticism in Marathi is considered to begin with the mid 19th century. Prefaces by the Doba Pandurang 1865, Parsuram Tantya Godbole 1867, and Mahadev Moreswar Kunte 1869. Similarly, in Gujarati, the literary tradition is considered to have begun with the lexicography and poetry of Hemchandra, 10,000 1088 to 11,073, who also wrote distinguished criticism in Sanskrit. But critical tradition is traced back only up to Nawal Ram and Govardhan Ram. It is quite inconceivable that the Bhasha produced that the Bhashas produce great literature for half a millennium or more without developing literary criticism in however crude a form. Or is it that Indian literary history has been insensitive to the development? So I think this is very clear that this paragraph is talking about the crisis that has been created, and he is asking where has the entire body of criticism gone, which was produced by the Bhashas, whether Marathi or Bengali or Gujarati. He gives examples from these two great bhashas and the literatures that were produced by these two bhashas and for several hundred years. And he's asking where is the literary criticism? Because if you have literature from a language, okay, for 300, 400 years, then can we imagine that 400 year will not produce a single critical theory or critical or criticism of that particular literature or the tradition of that literature in that bhasha? So I think the introduction is unfolding the very idea of this entire book and the problem of this book, and this is associated with our paper because we are studying modern Indian writings and in English translation, but we have no modern Indian criticism to study these Indian these translations in English. I mean, hardly there is. I mean, if we are studying, for example, say Anda Yug or Mukti Bodh or Amrita Pritam or Senapati, do we have literary criticism from these languages that has been translated into English and that we can apply in understanding this body of literature in English translation? So that's, I think, a very, very important question. Or do we need only the canon or only the tools that we have internalized from our Western education to apply to English translation of modern Indian writings that come from different modern Indian languages or bhashas? So the question is actually evolving and it is opening our eyes. And
Oh,
somewhere we
sir.
have started. Yes.
Sir, I have a question.
Yeah.
Uh, Sir, what comes first, the literature or literary theory?
Okay, I'll come to that. Huh? I'll come to that. Just let us work on this right now. And uh, if a more reliable literary history to be postulated, a more accurate description of Bhasha tradition will have to be offered. It will be necessary to examine closely the role played by printing technology in increasing the volume of critical articulations as distinct from its impact on critical sensibility. Similarly, the process of assimilation of Western modernity into Indian tradition, a process which leads very alien intellectual tool, a ritual status before internalizing it, calls for careful scrutiny. Naturally, a recognized historical perspective, if it is sufficiently realistic, will contribute towards evolving a more useful description of literary criticism in India and rid it of the static images of Western criticism and Sanskrit poetics. So this writer is uh, critical of the both the tradition, whether of Western criticism or of Sanskrit poetics, and is in a way talking about a third area of the criticism that must have been produced by Bhasha literatures, and uh, how that the process of assimilation of Western modernity into Indian tradition, a process which leads alien intellectual. So this paragraph actually introduces us to that area where we may contemplate on the way we study literature is more like a ritualistic practice. Say, we have created a ritual, a story, a taboo, or something like that in terms of a text, and then we have got tools from Europe or from Western world, and those tools are alien. Of course they are alien because they are not to be they are we are trying to universalize them. We think that they are universal, apply them everywhere in the world, but that's not true, because tools are also geographical. Tools are also part and parcel uh, of the development that happens in the societies, whether the development is psychological or religious or anthropological. So you see, say there has come up an idea that whatever Western tools are, whether of literature or of technology or of science or of whatever, we have started believing and that they are universal and apply anywhere in the third world, South Africa or Asia or Latin America and everywhere. So that is, that whole idea of being colonized and not realizing that we are colonized. Okay, and so, the essay, while unfolding 3 to 4 paragraphs by now, has actually introduced us to several issues and the network, the interconnections. And the book has started communicating with the history, with the Western canons, with Western literary criticism, with colonization, and with the how Indian traditions of bhasha and their criticism have become almost, you see, lost, and we have no idea where are they. Okay, so we are translating the text, for example, stories and poems and novels, but where is the criticalness that the society must have produced for this area? So it is more reliable literary history to be postulated. Okay, that I've read. Uh, any So you see, this essay creates a distance not only with Western criticism, but also with Sanskrit poetics, and creates a third area. This should be very clear now in this essay. That is that of bhasha, or the modern Indian languages. Any discussion of literary criticism or other forms of literary activity in modern India involves the use of the terms India and the West. In term, the term India may be valid in the pages of an atlas, but as a cultural label, it is hopelessly inadequate and simplistic. A product of colonial historiography, the term brings with it politically colored self-image and the suggestion of cultural amnesia. It You see, this is here the word comes for the first time. It can be said that colonialism gave rise to an equally false image of the West in India, an image that is larger than life, static, and apparently invincible. Accordingly, the Indian view of the West has remained fraught with idealization, arbitrary fragmentation, and unhistorical reductions. The disfiguring colonial epistemology has created false frameworks of cultural values and has stratified knowledge into superior Western and inferior Indian categories. So this paragraph says, well, the word India is okay in Atlas. Politically, you can describe this country, but so far as to talk about Indian culture, the word India, its image as a as an image on globe or on map is not sufficient. When you get into the cultural India, that is very, very complex, much more complex than the image that we have been brought up to be fed on, okay, or to be cultivated. And that is here you see he says, well, have we he's asking, have we actually adopted very simplistic ways of understanding our cultural maps? Okay, uh, are we only satisfied with the political maps and the geographical boundaries and the idea of India, or we need to understand the cultural maps and cultural boundaries and cultural historical movements of the cultures of India, and that all these cultures have to be traced in the bhashas. So this is the this is the, this is insight. And here we say, here he says, well, there is an amnesia here, there is a forgetfulness, there is a loss of memory here. An attempt has been made in this essay to establish how these false images, so he says these are false images. False images. Why false images? Because they are asking us to believe in something. So if I believe in water, then I am also given to believe that I should also believe in the rainfall. Okay. So whereas I need to understand rainfall as a very complex thing, and it occurs, I mean, this is a separate study, but sometimes you have this false image or false consciousness that I know my culture, I know my literature, I know my, and whenever I say I know, I by that I mean Sanskrit or Kalidas. I don't mean by that the last 1500 years bhashas, their literatures, their cultures, and their criticism, and then so many traditions within these geographical lands, and they are so complex, and we have reduced them to just one image. So image, political image of India is okay, and geographical image is there, and we all understand that. But so far as cultural image is concerned, we need to rethink about that entire project. An attempt has been made in this essay to establish how these false images can create profoundly mistaken modes of literary criticism. The term India, as used within the pages of this essay, presupposes no cultural unity or integration of the subcontinent. It is certainly more meaningful to speak in terms of specific linguistic traditions and regions than to speak of an imaginary cultural unit and unity. So he says, well, this imaginary cultural unity. So most of the times we keep on speaking, we are one, diversity, and we are a family and all that. But he says, well, this is a false image. We must understand that diversity as it has existed historically, and we must understand where has it gone. I mean, why has that amnesia occurred? Now we are to supplying very simplistic cultural images to us, uh, to compensate the loss of the greatest treasures of India and their critical traditions. Okay, so this goes this way. Instead of using the long and cumbersome expression literature in the modern Indian languages, I have used the traditional term bhasha. Thus, bhasha literature or bhasha criticism, but the label merely indicates a manageable group of many different literatures. It should be understood in the same manner as labels like European literature and Commonwealth literature. So he is now talking about the nomenclature. I think yesterday we were talking about. So he says, well, nomenclature, modern Indian languages should be bhasha and bhasha literature and bhasha criticism. Once you start you saying bhasha criticism, bhasha literature, then perhaps you will think about where is the what tradition is there. But the label merely indicates a manageable group of many different literatures. It should be understood in the same manner as label like European literature and Commonwealth literature. I have drawn illustrations from several bhashas, but I have depended mainly on Marathi and Gujarati, the bhashas I follow. and occasionally on Indian English criticism. There are numerous Bhasha critics who write criticism in English as well. Bilingualism in critical and literary writing has been a traditional feature of Indian culture. It needs to be seen as a matter of cultural strategy of a people brought up on the dialects of the Marga and the Desi, a great tradition and little traditions, rather than in terms of a superficial linguistic choice. However, the main concern of this essay is Bhasha criticism. So, in this paragraph, he is talking about, clearly formulating his idea that he is to uh, discuss the crisis in contemporary literary criticism in India caused by what has been described here as a lapse in cultural memory. So, lapse in cultural memory or amnesia. Okay. And for that, he will take up examples from Marathi and Gujarati. And then this is the main concern of this essay is Bhasha criticism, not or anything else. I made a conscious attempt to minimize as far as possible Western paradigms of intellectual inquiry and to draw as much as one can on what could be called pre unpretentiously the modern Indian intellectual discourse. This discourse seems to have been gradually emerging in recent years through the collective effort of intellectuals like M.N. Srinivasan in sociology, Romila Thapar and Ranjit Guha in history, Anil Seal and Partha Chatterjee political science, Sudhir Kakkar in psychology, Ashish Nandi cultural history and psychology, and Meenakshi Mukherjee and Bhal Chandra Nemade literary criticism. Though gradually ascendant, it has numerous gaps which make crudeness unavoidable in an argument dependent on it. Yet to lean on it rather than on the excessively sophisticated but Eurocentric Western theory seems to me to be a desirable cultural and critical strategy in this essay, which views criticism as a cultural subsystem rather than a web of abstract theoretical constructs. So, so this paragraph then tells about tells us that this discourse seems to have been gradually emerging in recent years. Then there are certain names of scholars and intellectuals, professors, and then uh, he says, well, Eurocentric Western theory. He's not going to focus on the Western critical theory and those ideas in a major way, only except here and there. Okay. And the last sentence is crucial, that be a desirable cultural and critical strategy in this essay, which views criticism as a cultural subsystem. He says, well, this essay views criticism as a cultural subsystem rather than a web of abstract theoretical constructs. So criticism is not a web of abstract theoretical constructs, but it is a subsystem. So that's where the answer of that question, Faz, is literary theory and literary criticism. Criticism is a subsystem, cultural subsystem, whereas literary theory is abstract theoretical construction. I can elaborate that later, but this is the somewhere the answer is here in the sentence. There is no point in merely running down the Indian tendency to imitate the West. Even the most original of the 20th century Indian thinkers, Shri Aurobindo, M.N. Roy, Mahatma Gandhi, could not escape the impact of Western thought. Cultural forms and intellectual institutions do keep changing continuously, and no post-colonial society can claim to have come unscathed out of colonial period. The colonial past cannot just be wished away, but it is desirable to question the efficacy of the intellectual tools produced during the past. Colonial experience releases several conflicting tendencies in the colonized society. One obvious tendency is to imitate the colonizers and to win their approval, but it may also give rise to nationalist feelings and create the tendency to resist the colonial influence. It creates simultaneously a revivalistic romanticism and a hard headed political pragmatism. The simultaneous release of several conflicting tendencies results in a strange, superficial cultural dynamics. A colonized culture becomes violently progressive and militantly retrogressive, and in consequence tends to remain static. This is important sentence. A colonized culture becomes violently progressive and militantly regressive, and in consequence tends to remain static. So these are two different poles of a colonized culture. Either it is violently progressive, radically progressive, or it is militantly retrogressive. Retrogressive is opposite of the word progressive, as we were discussing yesterday, which means that either we are remembering our past, ancient past, and who were we, or we are talking about what ideal thing can we achieve in future by radical ideas. But if we have these two poles, and if they pull each other, then things remain static. In order to understand this cultural immobilization, so this is immobility, there is no mobility in these between these two poles, on an appropriate historiography is of prime importance. A wishful revivalistic recreation of history increase the gap between the cultural changes as they are and the modes of intellect used to perceive them. Similarly, an ideological and arbitrary conception of the process of modernization as a unified progression cannot satisfactorily explain intellectual institutions such as literary criticism, which do not seem to fit into ideological paradigms of tradition or change. The present essay is a modest and tendentious attempt to describe some prominent features of the crisis with the reference to literary criticism in India. So this is elaboration of the two poles and how they impact the culture and literary criticism. Each literature demands its own kind of literary historiography. In India, this field has remained almost totally neglected. A major consequence of this neglect is that the general framework of assumption about Indian culture and literature postulated by European Indologists like William Jones, L. Brecht, Weber, George Grierson, Morris, Winternis, and so on continues to be in operation. This is not to say that no writing in the area of literary history has been done by Indian scholars, but these writings have retained the general Indological framework, including its basic assumption that the beginning of modern Indian literature is synonymous and synchronous with the British colonial period. Sir William Jones, the founder of Indology, declared in the third anniversary discourse in 1786 that in all these inquiries concerning the history of India, I shall confine my researches downward to the Mohammedan conquests at the beginning of the 11th century, but extend them upward as high as possible to the earliest authentic records of human species. Under the influence of this view, classical Indian India became glorious and British India became progressive. But the intervening centuries became culturally a period of continuous vulgarization. This methodological uh, convenience has turned into a historiographical convention and has come to be accepted as an undisputed principle of Indian literary history. Criticism developing from such misleading historiography is naturally ill equipped to break new theoretical ground. This essay, therefore, moves from a description of the crisis in criticism towards proposing a tentative historiography of Indian criticism. So, you see, this is the end of this essay, and what is there in the last few paragraphs is that the historiography, that is the writing of history, historiography, writing of history of Indian literature has been uh, periodized in the sense either uh, where where Britishers begin, our modernity begins, and before that, we are ancient. So either we are very glorious people in the tradition of Sanskrit and that literature, or we are suddenly after British India, modern people and modern literature begins. And in between the two, there is nothing. In between the two, there is nothing, and this nothing is actually something, but we are ill-equipped to deal with this something, which is of the area of bhasha, which is the area of the entire India. So the cultural complexity, literary ness, and the literary criticism and literary traditions of this period. So he says, well, we need to rewrite our history of literature as well, and we need to change our tools of historiography. Unless we do that, we will be only conceiving either we were glorious or we were colonized.